Hello and welcome. Tonight's story begins not with wonder, but with rupture. A xenobiology classroom aboard a drifting interstellar station tears open under a lethal radiation surge. A human exchange student, labeled a Deathworlder, becomes the only one capable of surviving what follows. Bulkheads fail, oxygen thins, escape pods launch without them. What unfolds is not just a fight against vacuum and fire, but a choice that defines what survival truly means. Stay with us. The xenobiology dome shattered without warning. A hairline fracture flashed across the transparent alloy, then spidered outward in a violent bloom. Atmosphere screamed into vacuum. Papers, data slates, and 3 alien students were ripped toward the rupture in a spiraling cyclone of air and light. Emergency klaxons detonated through the classroom. Gravity flickered. Elena's chair skidded backward as pressure dropped hard enough to steal breath from her lungs. Zixar's tendrils flailed, grasping at nothing. Meloop's gelatinous body stretched thin, beginning to vaporize at the edges. Bulkheads slammed halfway down, jammed by debris. The star outside flared white across the viewport, radiation alarms layering over decompression warnings. Elena hit the floor, fingers hooking into a maintenance seam. The pull intensified. Another panel blew outward. Someone screamed over comms, cut short mid-syllable. The dome continued to fracture, blooming wider, hungry for everything inside. Professor Virex's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and amplified over the failing intercom. Radiation spike detected. Stellar flare magnitude 7. The viewport dimmed as emergency filters struggled to compensate. But the light outside burned through in violent pulses. The star was shedding plasma in rhythmic detonations, each wave slamming into Astria 9's weakened shielding grid. Status panels cascaded from amber to crimson. Magnetic containment fields flickered. Oxygen reserves in the breached sector dropped below survivable thresholds. Somewhere deep in the station's spine, a reactor coughed and stuttered. Elena felt the vibration through the decking beneath her palms. This was no simple hull fracture. The radiation surge had overloaded the station's defensive lattice, and the timing was too precise to be coincidence. As the bulkhead motors groaned and failed, Virex transmitted one final warning. All sectors brace. Shield collapse in 60 seconds. Astria 9's Central A. I projected the numbers across every surviving surface. Structural integrity, 42%. Oxygen loss rate, critical. Orbital drift, accelerating toward the radiation belt. Time to cascading reactor failure, 39 minutes and falling. Elena forced herself to breathe in controlled intervals, ignoring the metallic taste in the thinning air. 3 students remained beyond the jammed bulkhead. 2 escape pods were already auto-priming. The math was brutal, even if shields stabilized. The radiation exposure would turn lethal long before rescue could cross the sector. Zixar's voice trembled over a private channel, asking what the probability of survival was. The AI responded without hesitation. 12% if evacuation initiated immediately. Less than 3 if a retrieval attempt was made. The numbers hung there, sterile and merciless. Elena looked at the sealed corridor ahead and made her decision. Beyond the warped bulkhead, the trapped students drifted in a corridor half stripped of atmosphere. Emergency strobes flashed against twisted alloy ribs, painting everything in violent red. Meloop clung to a ceiling conduit, his gelatinous body thinning where vacuum tugged at him. Zixar's camouflage flickered uncontrollably, stress overriding instinct. A 3rd student lay pinned beneath a collapsed support beam, suit ruptured, oxygen venting in a ghostly plume. The corridor's gravity failed in pulses, slamming them down one moment and releasing them the next. Radiation warnings screamed through Elena's wrist display as she assessed the scene. The bulkhead motors behind her whined, threatening to seal permanently. If it closed, they would suffocate. If it stayed open, decompression would tear the entire sector apart. Elena anchored her boots to the decking seam and reached for the jammed control housing, knowing there would be no second attempt. Elena ripped the control housing open with her bare hands. Alloy cracking under raw leverage. Protocol demanded sector isolation, not rescue. The AI repeated evacuation advisories in a calm, synthetic tone. She muted it. Radiation washed through the corridor in invisible waves, ionizing the air with a bitter metallic scent. Zixar shouted that the shielding grid would collapse if she forced the bulkhead. She forced it anyway. Hydraulic pistons screamed as she wedged her shoulder beneath the descending slab, muscles trembling under crushing pressure. The gravity field surged, doubling her weight for a breathless second. Bones held. She shoved upward and triggered a manual override with her elbow. The slab locked halfway, leaving a narrow opening. Enough. No protocol covered this. No species exchange guideline anticipated it. Elena stepped through the breach into the radiation-scorched corridor, leaving procedure behind and choosing consequence. The radiation hit like heat without flame. Elena felt it first as a prickling across her exposed skin, then deeper, a crawling ache beneath muscle and bone. Her wrist dosimeter spiked into lethal range, numbers climbing too fast to track. She sealed the torn sleeve of her station jacket around her forearm and pushed forward. The air shimmered with ionized particles, carrying the metallic taste of burnt circuitry. Maloop slipped from the conduit, partially liquefied, and Elena caught him against her chest before he drifted into vacuum. Zixar staggered, camouflage failing as his exoskeleton cracked under stress. Another flare detonated outside, flooding the corridor with white light. Pain sharpened, but she moved anyway. Each step deliberate. Human physiology bought minutes others didn't have. Minutes were enough. She reached the pinned student and gripped the twisted beam. Knowing this would cost her, gravity failed completely. The corridor tilted into silence as loose debris, fractured panels, and droplets of escaping coolant began to drift in slow spirals. Elena's magnetic boots disengaged with a metallic click, and she pushed off the warped decking, guiding herself hand over hand along exposed conduits. Melope floated beside her, reforming in unstable ripples, while Zixar clung to a cable, his color pattern strobing in panic. Ahead, the pinned student rotated helplessly, tether line tangled around shattered framework. Radiation pulses flickered through the hull like distant lightning, each surge making Elena's vision spark at the edges. She timed her movements between gravity fluctuations, anchoring herself whenever the field spasmed back online. Every motion had to be precise. In 0G, a mistake didn't just slow you down, it sent you drifting toward vacuum, or deeper into the dead zone. A warning glyph flashed across Elena's visor, pressure differential ahead. The corridor narrowed into a twisted choke point where the hull had peeled back, exposing a pocket of pure vacuum. The last thin veil of air shimmered at the boundary, rippling like invisible water before spilling outward. Zixar's breath rasped in her calm as his internal sacs struggled against the sudden drop. Elena inhaled once, deep and measured, then kicked forward. Sound vanished instantly. Her heartbeat thundered inside her skull, while frost crystallized along the edges of her lashes. She hooked one arm through a fractured support beam and used the momentum to sling herself across the vacuum gap. Meloop's form stretched thin behind her, nearly tearing apart, until she caught him and dragged him through the silent void. She exhaled only after slamming into the far bulkhead. The next gravity surge hit without warning. Artificial fields snapped back online at double intensity, slamming everything in the corridor downward. Elena barely had time to brace before her boots magnetized and her body crashed against the deck. Zixar wasn't anchored. He dropped hard, exoskeleton striking twisted alloy with a crack that echoed like breaking glass. Meloop splattered across the floor in a spreading wave, reforming sluggishly. Overhead, a fractured conduit tore free and came down in a shower of sparks. Elena rolled, taking the impact across her shoulder, then lunged toward Zixar. His camouflage flickered weakly, color patterns failing under shock. A support beam shifted again, pinning his lower limbs. Radiation hissed through the metal like static. Elena gripped the beam and heaved, muscles screaming, bones grinding under load. The alloy bent. Zixar came free, but something inside her arm tore with a sharp, irreversible snap. They reached a secondary control node, wedged behind a collapsed conduit cluster. Emergency power flickered across the interface in dim pulses. Zixar interfaced through a trembling tendril, siphoning residual data before the system failed completely. Files cascaded across Elena's visor. Restricted research archives flagged under Professor Virex's credentials. Radiation spike modeling, shield degradation simulations, human physiological stress projections labeled Deathworld baseline. Timestamp overlays aligned perfectly with the flare event. This wasn't random stellar violence. It was calibrated exposure, a containment test disguised as accident. Meloop rippled in disbelief as logs revealed survival thresholds, evacuation delay metrics, sacrifice variables. Elena felt the weight settle heavier than the beam she had lifted. They had been studied, measured, expected to fail. The station groaned as another radiation pulse slammed into the hull. Zixar's voice came through thin and shaken. "We were data." Zixar recoiled from the interface as if it had burned him. His exoskeleton dimmed to a dull gray, camouflage shutting down entirely. "She calculated loss ratios," he whispered, voice fracturing through static. Meloop's form tightened, density spiking in agitation. The logs continued to scroll, human muscular endurance curves, radiation tolerance margins, projected casualty acceptance thresholds. Elena's name appeared more than once. Subject viability, optimal, emotional resistance, variable. The flare outside detonated again, rattling the node housing, somewhere distant. A bulkhead finally failed with a metallic scream. Virex had framed it as curiosity, as science, as understanding death, world resilience. But the numbers were cold. Acceptable fatalities. Controlled chaos. Elena flexed her injured arm, pain flaring bright and immediate. Betrayal didn't change the countdown. It only clarified it. "We deal with her later," she said, voice steady. "Right now, we survive." The control node dimmed as another surge drained its last reserve. Elena closed the archived files with a flick of her wrist. Anger could wait. Oxygen could not. Reactor heat signatures were climbing toward critical. If the core breached, no research log would matter. Zixar's breathing sacs fluttered erratically. Meloop's structure destabilized at the edges. They were reaching their physiological limits. Elena wasn't. Not yet. That difference was the point of the experiment. Fine, she would use it. She accessed the station schematic and plotted a route toward the primary reactor chamber, cutting through a radiation corridor marked lethal for non-human biology. The AI attempted to block authorization. She overrode it with manual command codes, stripped from the hidden logs. Protocol shattered. "We stabilize the core," she said. "Then we call for rescue." The deck trembled beneath them, as if the station itself was waiting for her answer. Heat rolled down the corridor in visible waves. The closer they moved toward the primary reactor, the more the air thickened with the smell of scorched insulation and ionized metal. Warning sigils crawled across Elena's visor. Core containment breach imminent. Through a fractured viewport, she caught a glimpse of the reactor chamber, an immense sphere of magnetic coils flickering around a white-hot plasma heart. The shielding lattice stuttered with every stellar pulse. Zixar staggered, exoskeleton blistering where radiation seeped through microfractures. Meloop altered density repeatedly to keep his form from boiling apart. The floor plates vibrated under rising thermal expansion, bolts shearing loose in sharp metallic pops. A tremor rippled through the station's spine. The AI announced a cascading failure in the secondary coolant loops. If the bleed continued unchecked, the reactor would not explode. It would melt inward, consuming Astrea 9 from its core. The oxygen scrubbers failed with a soft, almost polite chime. Then the air thinned rapidly. Elena felt it first as a pressure behind her eyes, a narrowing of sound, like cotton packing her ears. Zixar collapsed to one knee, respiration sacs fluttering in desperate rhythm. Meloop's surface began to foam, losing cohesion as atmospheric balance destabilized. The reactor chamber doors hissed open halfway before freezing in place, starved of power. Red glyphs scrolled across the wall, O2 saturation dropping below survivable thresholds for 3 species present. Elena forced her breathing slow and deliberate, pulling in what little remained. Human tolerance bought minutes. Zixar did not have minutes. She tore a portable emergency tank from the wall and snapped the mask across his intake vents. The gauge showed barely 20% charge, enough to move, not enough to linger. A deep mechanical thud echoed through the station as the final evacuation pod disengaged from its cradle. Elena felt the vibration through her boots before the AI confirmed it. Automatic launch sequence complete. No manual override, no recall. Through a narrow viewport, she saw the pod flare bright against the radiation-washed darkness, engines igniting in desperate retreat. Zixar's eyes fixed on the shrinking silhouette, something between hope and accusation flickering in his gaze. Meloop's mass sagged toward the deck, density fluctuating in exhaustion. The corridor lights dimmed further as remaining power rerouted to core containment. Escape had just left orbit. Elena's jaw tightened, not in regret, but in recalculation. With no pods remaining, survival meant stabilization or death. The station shuddered again, hull groaning as orbital decay accelerated. The star's glare filled the viewport, vast and indifferent. Astrea 9 shifted beneath them with a slow, nauseating lurch. External sensors projected the trajectory in cold blue lines across Elena's visor. Their orbit was decaying, spiraling toward the outer edge of the star's radiation belt. The station's thrusters had gone dark, guidance systems locked in standby after the power cascade. Through the fractured viewport, the star loomed larger, its surface boiling with arcs of white plasma. Each flare distorted the hull's shadow, bathing the corridor in violent flashes. Zixar's breathing grew shallow despite the emergency tank, and Meloop's density wavered with every gravitational hiccup. The AI recalculated impact probability with mechanical detachment if the orbit continued to degrade. Astrea 9 would not burn up. It would be shredded by radiation and torn apart by tidal forces long before reaching atmospheric friction. Elena felt the drift in her bones and knew time was narrowing. The radiation wave struck like a silent detonation. Elena's visor flooded with static as her dosimeter surged past previously lethal thresholds. The corridor lights burst one by one, plunging them into a strobe-lit nightmare of white flashes and deep shadow. Heat rippled through the metal floor, and the air tasted like burning copper. Zixar screamed as the emergency tank sputtered under ion overload. Meloop's form destabilized, edges blistering and evaporating into translucent mist. Elena's skin prickled, then moaned from within, as if every cell vibrated against itself. Her pulse hammered, vision narrowing to a tunnel edged with sparks. The star outside flared again. Closer now, massive arcs of plasma licking across space. The shielding grid failed completely. There was no buffer left, only distance, endurance, and the raw tolerance of human biology stood between them and total cellular collapse. The comms grid died without ceremony. One moment static crackled in Elena's ear. The next there was nothing but her own breathing and the distant groan of stressed metal. Zixar's channel cut first, then the AI's calm monotone dissolved into silence. Darkness pressed in as emergency lighting surrendered to total power loss. Only the star's intermittent flares lit the corridor, throwing violent shadows across twisted alloy. Meloop lay half-solid beside her, movement sluggish, density unstable. Elena tried a manual signal ping. No response. They were no longer a sector of Astrea 9. They were a fragment adrift inside a dying machine. The isolation hit harder than the radiation, without coordination, without guidance. Survival narrowed to instinct and will. She flexed her burned fingers, feeling tendons strain but hold. Alone did not mean defeated. It meant decision time. For a moment, the corridor dissolved into something warmer. Elena tasted chlorine and sunlight instead of ionized metal. A track field under a blue earth sky flashed through her mind, lungs burning, legs trembling, a coach's voice counting down the last stretch, marathon training in thin winter air, the discipline of controlled breathing when muscles begged to quit. Blood drives in crowded clinics where strangers rolled up sleeves without hesitation. Humans survived by enduring pain together. The memory steadied her pulse. Radiation still chewed at her cells. The star still roared beyond the hull. But she remembered what exhaustion truly felt like. And this was not it yet. She had more to give. Meloop's unstable mass quivered beside her. Zixar barely conscious under the failing tank. Earth had taught her something simple. Pain was data, not destiny. She opened her eyes to the darkness and chose to keep moving. The simplest calculation surfaced first. Conserve energy. Retreat deeper into the station's shadowed spine. Wait for external rescue. Alone. She might survive long enough. Zixar would not. Meloop certainly would not. The oxygen tank was nearly dry, and the radiation curve was climbing again. Elena felt the fracture in her arm throb in rhythm with her pulse. She could cut losses. No protocol forbade it now. No authority watched. The experiment had already measured her limits. The question was whether she would accept them. She looked at Zixar's dimmed exoskeleton and Meloop's unstable mass and understood something brutal. Survival defined in isolation was just another form of failure. Humans endured because they carried weight that wasn't strictly theirs. She tightened the emergency straps across Zixar's body and shifted Meloop into her grasp. If she was going to burn, it would not be alone. Elena forced herself upright despite the tremor in her legs. The reactor chamber loomed ahead, its containment lattice flickering like a dying heartbeat. She accessed the schematic from memory, mapping a manual reroute that would divert remaining power into a localized shielding array. It would seal the radiation corridor long enough to stabilize the core, but only if someone engaged it from inside the chamber. Zixar tried to protest, his voice thin through the last breath of oxygen. She cut the channel gently. There was no room for argument. She anchored Meloop against the outer wall and stepped toward the manual override conduit, ignoring the sharp pulse in her broken arm. The metal was already hot under her palm. The choice was made. Not survival at any cost. Survival with purpose. She pulled the emergency lever. The reactor chamber doors groaned open under Elena's manual override. Inside, the core burned like a captive star, magnetic coils spasming around a white-hot plasma sphere. Heat pressed against her skin in suffocating waves. Warning glyphs flooded her visor, but she muted them. The manual stabilization console sat on a narrow platform extending over the containment ring. One slip meant falling into lethal radiation flux. She stepped forward, boots locking against the vibrating alloy. Her broken arm screamed as she forced it to steady the control lever. The shielding lattice flickered erratically, each pulse threatening total collapse. She counted her breaths, slow and precise. As she rotated the coolant valve beyond safe parameters, the chamber roared in protest. The plasma sphere dimmed fractionally. Not enough. She leaned harder into the controls, absorbing the radiation surge that followed. The hull rupture above the reactor chamber widened under thermal stress, a jagged wound venting radiation into space. Meloop dragged himself toward it, form rippling in unstable waves. He understood without explanation. Density control was instinct, but holding a fixed structure under stellar radiation was not. He began to compress, molecular bonds tightening beyond normal tolerance. His surface darkened, edges hardening into a crystalline sheen. The vacuum howled through the gap as he pressed himself against the breach. The first contact tore at him, radiation blistering his outer layer. He held anyway. Elena saw the containment reading stabilize by a fraction as Meloop's body fused with twisted alloy, sealing microfractures one by one. Each second cost him cohesion. Portions of his mass vaporized into glittering mist. Still, he reinforced the seal, buying her time to finish the stabilization sequence, with the core flux dipping below detonation threshold. Zixar forced himself upright against the reactor wall. The emergency tank had gone silent. He was breathing raw. Ionized air now. His exoskeleton shimmered faintly, adaptive cells struggling to maintain coherence. He accessed the external comm array through a fractured junction panel, rerouting residual reactor output into a focused transmission burst. The star's radiation storm masked most outgoing signals, scattering them into noise. Zixar compensated by altering his own bioluminescent camouflage, amplifying the frequency through his body as a living signal lens. Light flared along his shell in synchronized pulses, reflecting through the hull breach Meloop had sealed. Elena felt the surge as the transmission discharged, a single concentrated beam punching through the stellar interference. Somewhere beyond the radiation belt, Sensors would see it, if anyone was listening. The coolant valve screamed as Elena forced them into their final position. Magnetic coils realigned in a violent shudder, collapsing the unstable plasma arcs inward. For one suspended heartbeat, the reactor chamber filled with blinding white light. Heat surged across her skin, searing through fabric and flesh. Then the core contracted, containment fields stabilizing in a steady hum instead of chaotic shrieks. Radiation output dropped from catastrophic to survivable margins. The platform beneath her boots stopped vibrating. Across the chamber, Meloop's hardened mass sagged, but held. The hull breach sealed in a dim, crystalline patchwork. Zixar's light pulses faded to a weak glow as the transmission completed. Elena's vision blurred at the edges, black creeping inward like spilled ink. The reactor was locked. The station would not implode. But her body had absorbed the difference. The silence after stabilization felt heavier than the noise. Elena tried to step back from the console, but her legs failed without warning. Pain that had been distant and manageable surged all at once, flooding her nerves with white-hot clarity. Her broken arm gave out first, then her knees. She hit the reactor platform hard, cheek pressed against vibrating alloy, now cooling rapidly. The chamber light steadied into a low amber glow. Her dosimeter flickered once and went dark. Across the room, Zixar crawled toward her, movement slow and uneven. Meloop's crystalline seal shimmered faintly, pieces of him flaking away into dust. Elena attempted to inhale deeply and found her lungs unresponsive for a terrifying second. Then air returned in a ragged gasp. The world narrowed to heartbeat and breath, each one harder than the last. The reactor chamber settled into an uneasy quiet. No alarms, no tremors, only the distant hum of stabilized coils and the faint hiss of cooling metal. Outside the fractured viewport, the star still burned, but its fury no longer rattled the station apart. Elena lay motionless on the platform, eyes half open, seeing nothing. Zixar reached her side, placing a trembling tendril against her neck where pulse should be strongest. It was there, weak, irregular, but present. Meloop's crystalline seal held firm, though fragments of his hardened mass drifted away like glittering ash. The corridor lights flickered once more, then steadied. Somewhere beyond the radiation haze, a distant engine signature cut through the void, faint but real. Zixar lifted his gaze toward the sound, hope and fear coiling together. In the silence, survival waited for confirmation. Light returned gradually, filtered through med bay shielding instead of stellar flares. Elena surfaced from darkness to the steady pulse of diagnostic monitors and the antiseptic scent of recycled air. Her body felt distant, heavy, threaded with dull fire beneath the skin. Medical gel coated her arms where radiation burns had blossomed into angry maps. A brace immobilized the fracture in her forearm. She tried to move and was met with controlled resistance from stabilization fields. Across the chamber, Zixar rested inside a low-pressure cradle, exoskeleton patched with luminous sealant. Meloop floated within a containment tank, his mass diminished but cohesive. Rescue ships had docked. Astrea 9 remained in orbit, scarred but intact. Elena closed her eyes briefly, not from exhaustion, but from recognition. They had survived. The cost was written across every cell in her body. When Elena was cleared for limited movement, the observation deck filled slowly. Students who once whispered about Deathworld monsters now stood in uneasy silence. Zixar approached first, his repaired exoskeleton carrying faint scars that mirrored her own. Miloop drifted beside him, smaller but stable, crystalline flecks still embedded within his form. Professor Virex remained at the rear, posture rigid, research tablet dark at her side. No applause followed. No dramatic declaration, only recognition settling into the space like gravity returning after drift. They understood now what resilience meant when stripped of spectacle. Elena had not survived by overpowering the station or abandoning them. She had chosen to carry weight that was never required of her. In their gaze, fear was gone. What replaced it was something heavier and quieter. Respect. From the observation deck, Astria 9 looked fragile against the vast burn of the star. Repair drones traced slow arcs across its scarred hull, sealing fractures left by radiation and heat. Elena stood beside the viewport, medical brace visible beneath her sleeve, skin mapped with faint silver lines where burns had healed imperfectly. The station's orbit had stabilized, but not without loss. Meloop's mass would never fully return. Zixar's shell carried permanent discoloration. Elena felt a quiet weakness in her lungs when she breathed too deeply. Survival had left signatures on them all. Below, the reactor glowed steady and contained. She watched the star flare once more, no longer as an enemy, but as a reminder. Strength was never the point. The choice had been, in the reflection of the glass, a human stood, scarred, altered, and unbroken. In the end, the station endured, but at a cost etched into flesh and memory. Survival was not about strength, nor about proving dominance. It was about choosing to carry others when walking away would have been easier. In a universe filled with stars that burn without mercy, the rarest force is compassion under pressure. If this story moved you, follow the channel and join us for more cinematic journeys into the edges of space and the limits of the human spirit.